In a kingdom smothered by the plague, Queen Isabella of Valdres launched a reign of terror that made even death feel merciful. Her decree, 10 years of absolute silence. No voices, no prayers, no cries for help. Break the silence, and you lost your tongue, or your life. What followed was a descent into madness so deep it rewired human behavior, erased language, and scarred generations. But why did she do it? And what shattered her twisted peace in the final year? Like, to honor every silenced voice. Comment. If you could survive in silence, and subscribe for the chilling secret that broke the curse. In the shadows of medieval Europe, where power was measured not in gold, but in the trembling of subjects before their sovereign, there lived a queen whose very name became synonymous with a terror so profound that historians would struggle for centuries to comprehend the depths of her psychological warfare. Queen Isabella of Valdres, a woman whose beauty was said to rival the angels themselves, would orchestrate one of the most chilling experiments in human control ever documented in the annals of royal history. The year was 1347, and the Black Death had just begun its merciless march across the continent, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would reshape the very fabric of society. But in the remote kingdom of Valdres, nestled between the jagged peaks of the Carpathian Mountains, a different kind of plague was about to descend upon the people. This plague would not claim lives through disease, but through something far more insidious, the complete and utter destruction of the human spirit through enforced silence. Isabella had ascended to the throne at the tender age of 19, following the mysterious death of her husband, King Edmund the Bold, who had perished under circumstances so strange that court physicians whispered of supernatural intervention. Some claimed they had seen the young queen standing over his deathbed, her lips moving in what appeared to be an ancient incantation, her eyes reflecting a darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. The official cause of death was recorded as a sudden fever, but the servants who prepared the king's body spoke in hushed tones of the expression of absolute terror frozen upon his face, as if he had witnessed something so horrifying in his final moments that death itself had become a mercy. The transformation of Queen Isabella from a seemingly innocent young bride into a ruler of unprecedented cruelty did not happen overnight. Court records, discovered centuries later in the sealed chambers beneath Valdres Castle, reveal a woman consumed by an obsession with control that bordered on the pathological. She had grown up in a household where her father, Duke Magnus the Silent, had ruled through fear and intimidation. Believing that true power could only be achieved when subjects were reduced to nothing more than extensions of the ruler's will. But Isabella would take her father's philosophy to heights that even he could never have imagined. In the winter of 1348, following a series of peasant uprisings that had threatened the stability of her kingdom, the Queen issued a decree that would echo through history as one of the most bizarre and terrifying acts of royal tyranny ever recorded. The Edict of Eternal Silence, as it came to be known, mandated that every man, woman, and child within the kingdom's borders was forbidden from speaking a single word for a period of 10 years. The decree was not merely a symbolic gesture or a temporary punishment for rebellion. It was an absolute command, enforced with a brutality that defied comprehension. The Queen established a network of silent watchers, hooded figures who moved through the villages and towns like phantoms, their ears trained to detect even the faintest whisper, the softest sob, the most barely audible prayer. These watchers, recruited from the most fanatically loyal members of the royal guard, had undergone a ritual that involved the partial severing of their own tongues, ensuring their permanent silence and absolute dedication to their ghastly mission. The recruitment process for these silent watchers was itself a testament to the Queen's methodical approach to psychological warfare. Candidates were selected not merely for their loyalty, but for their demonstrated capacity for cruelty and their ability to function without the comfort of human connection. They underwent months of conditioning in the castle's deepest dungeons, where they were subjected to sensory deprivation techniques that stripped away their humanity layer by layer until only the Queen's will remained. Former prisoners, who survived their encounters with these creatures, described them as having eyes that reflected no light, voices that made no sound, and movements that seemed to defy the natural laws of human locomotion. The punishment for violating the edict was swift and merciless. The first offense resulted in the removal of the offender's tongue with a red-hot iron, performed in the town square, while the entire community was forced to watch in complete silence. The second offense, should the unfortunate soul manage to make sound through their mutilated mouth, resulted in death by a method so horrific that scribes of the time refused to record the details, referring to it only as the Queen's special judgment. Surviving accounts from neighboring kingdoms speak of refugees who fled Valdris with tales of executions so elaborate and prolonged that they seemed designed not merely to end life, but to serve as warnings that transcended the boundaries of normal human fear. The psychological methodology behind the Queen's approach revealed a sophisticated understanding of human nature that was centuries ahead of its time. She had observed that humans could endure almost any physical hardship if they retained the ability to communicate their suffering, to share their burden through words of comfort or rebellion. By removing this fundamental aspect of human connection, she had discovered a form of torture that attacked not just the body but the very essence of what made her subjects human. As months turned into years, the psychological impact of the enforced silence began to manifest in ways that even Queen Isabella had not anticipated. Children born during this period grew up without ever hearing human speech, developing a form of communication through elaborate gestures and expressions that became so complex it rivaled any spoken language. These children, known as the silent generation, would carry the trauma of their formative years for the rest of their lives, many never learning to speak properly even after the edict was eventually lifted. The development of this gestural language became one of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of the Queen's experiment. Anthropologists studying the surviving records have identified over 3,000 distinct hand signals and facial expressions that the silent generation created to replace verbal communication. These ranged from simple indicators of basic needs to complex philosophical concepts that could convey abstract ideas with a precision that sometimes exceeded spoken language. Children learned to read the subtlest changes in their parents' expressions, developing an almost supernatural ability to interpret emotional states through visual cues alone. The Queen herself underwent a transformation during these years that was perhaps even more disturbing than the suffering she inflicted upon her subjects. Court painters from the period, working under strict instructions to capture her likeness without making a sound, created portraits that reveal a woman whose beauty had become terrible to behold. Her eyes, once described as sparkling with intelligence and warmth, had taken on the cold, dead quality of winter ice. Her smile, when it appeared at all, had become a cruel slash across her face that spoke of secrets too dark for mortal comprehension. The royal court during this period resembled nothing so much as an elaborate theatrical performance in which all the actors had forgotten their lines. Nobles communicated through an intricate system of written notes, passed between them by silent servants who moved through the halls like ghosts. State business was conducted through documents that grew increasingly elaborate and flowery, as if the suppressed need for verbal expression had found outlet in written excess. The Queen herself spoke only during private audiences with foreign dignitaries, her voice having taken on an otherworldly quality after years of self-imposed limitation, described by one Venetian ambassador as the sound of winter wind through a cemetery at midnight. The ambassador's full report, discovered in the Vatican archives in the 19th century, provides a chilling first-hand account of life in the silent kingdom. He wrote of dining halls where hundreds of nobles sat in perfect silence, their meals punctuated only by the soft scraping of cutlery against plates and the rustle of fabric as servants moved between the tables. He described a dance he witnessed where couples moved through elaborate choreography without music, their steps synchronized by visual cues alone, creating what he termed a ballet of the damned. Most disturbing of all, he reported that after only 3 days in the kingdom, he found himself beginning to whisper, even when alone in his chambers, as if the very air had become hostile to human speech. Religious life in the kingdom underwent perhaps the most profound transformation. Churches that had once echoed with hymns and prayers became monuments to enforced contemplation. Priests conducted mass through elaborate pantomime, their congregations kneeling in rows of perfect silence, their prayers reduced to the movement of lips and the occasional tear that traced down a weathered cheek. Many religious scholars of the time argued that this forced silence had actually brought the people closer to God, that in their inability to voice their prayers, they had discovered a more pure form of spiritual communication. The theological implications of the Queen's edict created heated debates in monasteries and universities across Europe. Some argued that the enforced silence represented a return to the contemplative traditions of the early Desert Fathers, while others declared it a blasphemous attempt to silence the voice of God speaking through his people. The Pope himself issued a secret bull condemning the edict, but the document was never officially published, as the Vatican feared that open condemnation might provoke the Queen to even greater extremes of persecution against the clergy within her borders. But beneath this supposed spiritual awakening, darker currents flowed. Reports began to surface of strange rituals taking place in the deepest forests surrounding the kingdom, where groups of citizens would gather under cover of darkness to engage in what can only be described as orgies of sound. These gatherings, known as the screaming circles, involved participants releasing years of pent-up vocal expression in sessions that reportedly lasted until dawn, leaving the participants exhausted and often permanently hoarse. The screaming circles developed their own hierarchy and rituals that became increasingly elaborate as the years passed. Participants would arrive at designated clearings wearing masks crafted from bark and leaves, their identities hidden to prevent recognition by the silent watchers. The ceremonies would begin with quiet humming that gradually escalated into singing, shouting, and finally into primal screams that could be heard for miles across the mountain valleys. Some participants reported experiencing religious visions during these sessions, claiming to have communed directly with angels who had come to comfort them in their suffering. Others described a form of madness that overtook them, a temporary insanity that allowed them to forget the constraints of their daily existence and reconnect with their fundamental humanity. The Queen's own mental state during this period became the subject of intense speculation among the few foreign observers who were permitted to visit the kingdom. The papal legate, Cardinal Antonio Fierro, left behind a secret report that described the Queen as a woman who has gazed too long into the abyss of her own power and found there a reflection that has driven her beyond the boundaries of human understanding. He wrote of audience sessions where the Queen would sit in perfect stillness for hours, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the visible world, occasionally breaking into what he described as silent laughter, a convulsing of her body without sound that was more terrifying than any scream. The Cardinal's observations revealed a woman who had become addicted to the absolute control she wielded over her subjects. He noted that she would sometimes spend entire days watching her people from the castle towers, her face showing a mixture of satisfaction and hunger that suggested she drew sustenance from their suffering. More disturbing still were his accounts of private conversations, where the Queen would speak of her subjects as if they were characters in a play she was directing, expressing frustration when they failed to perform their roles with sufficient conviction. As the years passed, the economic impact of the Edict of Eternal Silence began to take its toll on the kingdom. Trade with neighboring regions virtually ceased, as merchants found it impossible to conduct business in a realm where negotiation and discussion were forbidden. The kingdom's famous markets, once bustling centers of commerce and social interaction, became surreal bazaars where business was conducted entirely through gestures and written signs, creating an atmosphere that foreign visitors described as deeply unsettling. The collapse of the kingdom's economy was gradual but inexorable. Craft guilds that had operated for centuries found themselves unable to pass on their knowledge to apprentices, as the subtle verbal instructions that had been handed down through generations were lost forever. Master craftsmen attempted to compensate by creating elaborate written manuals, but the nuances of technique that could only be communicated through spoken instruction gradually disappeared. The quality of goods produced in Valdris declined dramatically, leading to the loss of export markets that had sustained the kingdom's prosperity for generations. The agricultural productivity of the region also suffered dramatically. Farmers, unable to call out warnings to each other or coordinate their efforts through verbal communication, saw their harvests decline year after year. The tradition of work songs, which had helped coordinate group labor for generations, disappeared entirely, leaving behind a workforce that moved through their daily tasks with the mechanical precision of automatons, but none of the joy or community spirit that had once characterized rural life. The impact on animal husbandry was particularly severe. Shepherds could no longer call their flocks or communicate with their herding dogs through voice commands. Many animals, deprived of the vocal cues they had been trained to respond to, began to behave erratically. Livestock scattered across the mountainsides, and the kingdom's famous breeding programs, which had produced some of Europe's finest horses and cattle, collapsed entirely. The Silent Watchers were forced to develop new methods of animal control that relied entirely on visual signals and physical restraints. But these proved far less effective than traditional methods. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the reports of what became known as the silent madness, a form of psychological breakdown that affected increasing numbers of the population as the years of enforced silence stretched on. Victims of this condition would be found standing motionless for hours at a time, their mouths moving in what appeared to be endless, soundless conversation with invisible companions. Some would write obsessively, filling page after page with rambling text that often devolved into meaningless repetition of single words or phrases. Others would engage in elaborate performances of daily activities, miming conversations and interactions that existed only in their fractured minds. The progression of silent madness followed a predictable pattern that court physicians documented in their secret reports. The condition typically began with insomnia and anxiety, as victims struggled with the psychological pressure of constant self-surveillance. This was followed by a period of hypergraphia, where sufferers would write compulsively, often producing manuscripts of stunning beauty and terrifying content that revealed the depths of their psychological torment. The final stage involved a complete retreat from reality, as the mind, deprived of normal social interaction, created elaborate fantasy worlds that became more real to the sufferer than their actual circumstances. The Queen herself was not immune to the psychological toll of her own decree. Palace servants, speaking through written testimonies that would not surface until centuries later, described a ruler who had become increasingly isolated and paranoid. She would spend hours standing before mirrors, apparently engaged in silent conversation with her own reflection. The elaborate meals that had once been social events for the royal court became solitary affairs, with the Queen dining alone while servants watched from the shadows, ready to attend to her needs without making the slightest sound. The servants' accounts paint a picture of a woman slowly losing her grip on reality. They described finding her in the early hours of the morning, standing in empty corridors with her arms extended, as if embracing invisible figures. Her sleeping chambers were filled with hundreds of written notes addressed to her deceased husband, containing elaborate conversations that revealed her growing inability to distinguish between memory and reality. Most disturbing of all were the reports of her practicing speeches before empty thrones, gesturing and mouthing words to an audience that existed only in her fractured mind. The turning point came in the 8th year of the edict, when the Queen's own son, Prince Edmund, who had been only 3 years old when the silence began, attempted to speak his first words. The child, having reached an age where speech would naturally develop, began to make the soft babbling sounds that precede language. The Queen's reaction to this natural development was swift and terrifying. Court records indicate that she ordered the construction of a special chamber deep within the castle, lined with thick tapestries and sealed with heavy doors, where the prince would be kept in complete isolation until the edict's end. The construction of Prince Edmund's isolation chamber marked a new level of horror in the Queen's descent into madness. The room was designed with obsessive attention to acoustic detail, featuring double walls filled with sawdust, floors carpeted with layers of wool, and ceiling-to-floor tapestries that depicted scenes of angels with their mouths sewn shut. The only light came from a single window set high in the wall, beyond the child's reach, creating an environment that resembled nothing so much as a luxurious tomb. Food was delivered through a specially constructed slot that prevented any sound from escaping, and the child's caretakers were selected from among the silent watchers, ensuring that he would never hear another human voice. The prince's confinement marked the beginning of what historians would later identify as the Queen's final descent into complete madness. She began to issue increasingly bizarre commands through written decrees, ordering the construction of elaborate mechanisms designed to eliminate even the smallest sounds from daily life. Cartwheels were wrapped in thick cloth, horseshoes were replaced with leather alternatives, and even the castle's bells were silenced with layers of padding. The Queen's obsession with eliminating sound extended to increasingly absurd extremes. She ordered the construction of special slippers for all castle inhabitants, made from the fur of rabbits and designed to muffle footsteps completely. Windows throughout the castle were sealed with wax to prevent the sound of wind, and the courtyards were planted with soft moss instead of gravel to eliminate the sound of footsteps. Even the castle's cats were required to wear tiny leather boots, creating a surreal sight that visiting dignitaries found deeply unsettling. Foreign observers during this period noted that the kingdom had taken on an otherworldly quality, as if it existed in some realm between life and death. The famous chronicler Marco of Florence wrote of his visit to Valdris in the 9th year of the edict. "It is as if I have wandered into a kingdom of ghosts, where the living move with the silence of the dead and the very air seems heavy with unspoken words." The queen herself appears to be less a woman than a wraith. Her presence felt more than seen, her power emanating from her like cold radiating from winter stone. Marco's extended account provides crucial insight into the daily reality of life under the edict. He described marketplaces where vendors displayed their wares with elaborate written signs, creating a visual cacophony that was somehow more disturbing than the loudest verbal haggling. He witnessed children playing games of impossible complexity, their rules communicated entirely through gesture and expression, their laughter replaced by silent movements that conveyed joy without sound. Most memorably, he attended a wedding ceremony conducted entirely in pantomime, where the bride and groom exchanged vows through a series of hand gestures that brought tears to the eyes of witnesses who understood their meaning. The end of the Edict of Eternal Silence came not through royal decree but through a catastrophe that even Queen Isabella could not have anticipated. In the final year of the 10-year period, a massive earthquake struck the region, causing significant damage to the castle and surrounding villages. The natural human response to such a disaster, cries of fear, calls for help, shouts of warning, broke the enforced silence as people chose survival over obedience to their queen's mad decree. The earthquake struck at dawn on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, its tremors rolling across the kingdom, like the voice of the earth itself, crying out against the unnatural silence that had been imposed upon it. The silent watchers, trained to respond to human voices, found themselves paralyzed by the cacophony of natural sound as buildings collapsed, trees fell, and the very ground beneath their feet groaned and shifted. For the first time in nearly a decade, the people of Valdris heard their own voices as they called out in terror and desperation, the sound of human speech mixing with the rumble of destruction in a symphony of chaos and liberation. When the queen emerged from the castle ruins to survey the damage, she found herself facing a population that had rediscovered its voice in the face of natural disaster. The sight of her subjects speaking freely, helping each other with voiced coordination and comfort, reportedly sent her into a rage so profound that witnesses described her as appearing to grow larger and more terrible, her shadow seeming to stretch across the entire courtyard like a dark wing. But the spell had been broken. The earthquake had done what 10 years of suffering could not. It had reminded the people that there were forces greater than royal decree, that human nature itself would eventually reassert itself against even the most determined tyranny. The queen, realizing that her grand experiment in control had finally reached its end, retreated to her chambers and was never seen again by her subjects. The official records state that Queen Isabella died peacefully in her sleep 3 days after the earthquake, but the servants who discovered her body told a different story. They spoke of finding her in a position that suggested she had died while screaming, her mouth open in a silent cry that seemed to contain all the voices she had suppressed for a decade. Her eyes, they said, reflected not peace but a terror so complete that several of the servants fled the castle immediately and never returned. The room where the queen died had been transformed into a shrine to her obsession with silence. The walls were covered with thousands of written notes, creating a paper tapestry of madness that revealed the full extent of her psychological deterioration. Some notes contained single words repeated hundreds of times. Others featured elaborate diagrams, attempting to map the relationship between sound and power. And still others held fragments of conversations with long-dead relatives and imaginary advisors. The servants reported that the air in the room felt thick and oppressive, as if weighted down by all the words that had never been spoken during her reign. The kingdom that emerged from the 10 years of enforced silence was forever changed. The children of the silent generation struggled for years to develop normal speech patterns, many retaining the elaborate gestural language they had created as their primary form of communication. The economic and social structures that had been destroyed by the edict took decades to rebuild, and the psychological scars left by the Queen's experiment in human control would be passed down through generations. The process of reintegration proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Many adults found that after years of silence, their vocal cords had atrophied, leaving them with hoarse, weakened voices that required months of rehabilitation to restore. Others discovered that they had lost the ability to think in words, their minds having adapted to purely visual forms of cognition that made verbal communication feel foreign and unnatural. Support groups formed throughout the kingdom, bringing together survivors who shared the unique trauma of having lived through humanity's most extreme experiment in social control. The recovery process revealed the true depth of psychological damage inflicted by the Queen's decree. Physicians from neighboring kingdoms were called in to study what they termed vocal amnesia, a condition where survivors could understand spoken language but struggled to produce coherent speech themselves. Many former subjects reported experiencing phantom conversations, hearing voices that weren't there, as their minds attempted to fill the decade-long void of human discourse. Children who had never heard lullabies wept inconsolably when exposed to music for the first time, their nervous systems overwhelmed by sensory experiences their brains had never learned to process. The former silent watchers presented the most challenging cases for rehabilitation. Having undergone the Queen's conditioning and physical mutilation, they existed in a liminal state between human and automaton. Several attempts were made to reintegrate them into society, but their conditioning proved too complete. They would stand motionless for hours, still listening for forbidden sounds that no longer carried consequences. Most eventually retreated to abandoned monasteries in the mountains, forming communities of the permanently damaged who could find comfort only among others who shared their particular form of psychological scarring. Prince Edmund's emergence from his isolation chamber became a symbol of both hope and tragedy for the recovering kingdom. Now 13 years old, the prince had spent his formative years in complete sensory deprivation, developing a form of autism-like behavior that made normal social interaction impossible. He communicated only through elaborate drawings that depicted worlds of impossible beauty and terror, his artistic talent having flourished in isolation while his emotional development remained frozen at the age of 3. Teams of the kingdom's most skilled healers worked for years to help him develop speech, but he would never progress beyond simple words and phrases, his mind having adapted to silence in ways that could not be undone. The economic recovery of Valdris proved to be a generational undertaking. The kingdom's famous craftsmen had to rebuild their industries from fundamental principles, as the subtle knowledge that had been passed down through apprenticeships for centuries had been lost forever. New forms of written instruction were developed, but they could never fully replace the nuanced understanding that came from verbal teaching. The quality of Valdrian goods, once prized throughout Europe, declined permanently, and the kingdom never regained its former economic prominence. Agricultural recovery followed a similar pattern. Farmers had to relearn coordination techniques that their ancestors had perfected through generations of sung work rhythms and called instructions. The kingdom's famous harvest festivals, which had once featured elaborate musical celebrations, were replaced with solemn ceremonies that acknowledged both the return of prosperity and the permanent loss of cultural traditions. Many farming communities never fully recovered their previous productivity, as the social bonds that had made collective labor effective had been severed by the decade of enforced isolation. The psychological impact on families was perhaps the most profound and lasting consequence of the Queen's experiment. Parents and children who had been separated by the silence found themselves unable to reconnect emotionally. The natural process of family bonding, which depends heavily on verbal communication and shared vocal experiences, had been disrupted at crucial developmental stages. Many families sought help from traveling priests and healers, but the damage to familial relationships proved largely irreversible. Divorce rates soared as spouses discovered they had become strangers to each other during the silent years, their relationships having been reduced to mere cohabitation without emotional intimacy. The kingdom's religious life underwent a permanent transformation that reflected the deep spiritual trauma inflicted by the edict. Many survivors reported losing their faith entirely, unable to reconcile the concept of a benevolent deity with the suffering they had endured. Others developed intense, almost fanatical religious devotion, seeing their survival as evidence of divine intervention and spending hours each day in vocal prayer as if to make up for a decade of silent worship. New religious movements emerged that incorporated the gestural language of the silent generation into their rituals, creating hybrid forms of worship that honored both traditional practices and the unique cultural adaptations born from oppression. The fate of the elaborate gestural language developed by the silent generation became a subject of intense scholarly interest. Linguists from universities across Europe traveled to Valdres to study this unprecedented example of rapid language evolution, documenting the complex grammar and vocabulary that had emerged from necessity. Some communities chose to preserve this silent language as a cultural artifact, teaching it to their children, alongside spoken words as a reminder of their shared history. Others rejected it entirely, viewing it as a symbol of oppression that should be forgotten as quickly as possible. The long-term psychological studies conducted on survivors revealed patterns of behavior that would not be fully understood until centuries later. Many displayed symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, including hypervigilance around sound, anxiety disorders triggered by unexpected silence, and dissociative episodes during which they would revert to the gestural communication of their enforced silence. These symptoms often worsened with age, as the stress of maintaining normal social interaction took its toll on minds that had been fundamentally altered by their traumatic experiences. The children born during the final years of the edict presented unique challenges that highlighted the multi-generational impact of the Queen's experiment. These infants had spent their crucial early development in environments of unnatural quiet, their neural pathways forming without the auditory stimulation that normally guides language acquisition. Many remained partially deaf to certain frequencies, their auditory processing having adapted to filter out human voices as a survival mechanism. Others developed hyperacute hearing that made normal conversation painful, requiring years of gradual exposure therapy to build tolerance for everyday sounds. International reaction to the revelation of what had occurred in Valdres was swift and condemnatory. The Pope issued a formal bull declaring Queen Isabella's actions to be crimes against the natural order, while secular leaders across Europe used the example of Valdres as cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute monarchy. Trade embargoes were established against the recovering kingdom, not out of political animosity, but from a genuine fear that the psychological damage inflicted on the population might be somehow contagious. Diplomatic relations remained strained for decades as other nations struggled to understand how such an extreme form of social control could have been maintained for so long. The scholarly examination of the Queen's methods revealed a sophistication that was deeply disturbing to contemporary observers. Her understanding of psychological manipulation and social control demonstrated knowledge that seemed to anticipate discoveries in human behavior that would not be formally recognized by science for centuries. Some historians have suggested that Isabella had access to ancient texts on crowd psychology and mass manipulation, possibly derived from sources dating back to the Roman Empire or even earlier civilizations. Others propose that her methods were the result of intuitive genius combined with pathological obsession, a unique combination that allowed her to discover principles of human behavior through cruel experimentation. The documentation left behind by the Queen herself provided the most chilling insights into her mindset during the decade of silence. Her private journals, discovered sealed in a vault beneath the castle, revealed a woman who viewed her subjects not as human beings, but as components in a vast psychological experiment. She recorded detailed observations about the stages of adaptation to enforced silence, noting changes in behavior, productivity, and social cohesion with the detached precision of a natural philosopher studying laboratory specimens. Her final entries described her growing disappointment that the experiment had not achieved her ultimate goal of creating a population that would remain silent voluntarily, even after the edict was lifted. The influence of Queen Isabella's experiment extended far beyond the borders of Valdres, inspiring both fascination and horror among intellectuals across Europe. Secret societies formed in major cities dedicated to studying the techniques she had employed and the results she had achieved. Some sought to understand her methods in order to prevent similar atrocities, while others were drawn to the implications of her success in achieving total social control. These groups would eventually influence the development of political theory and social science, contributing to discussions about the nature of authority, consent, and the limits of governmental power that would continue into the modern era. The physical ruins of Valdres Castle became a pilgrimage site for scholars, artists, and the merely curious who sought to understand how such extreme tyranny had been possible. The castle's design, with its acoustic modifications and isolation chambers, provided a tangible record of the Queen's obsessions. Visitors reported experiencing profound unease within the castle walls, describing a quality of silence that felt oppressive even centuries after the edict had ended. Some claimed to hear whispers in the empty corridors, the voices of all those who had suffered in silence during Isabella's reign. Modern psychologists studying the historical accounts of Queen Isabella's reign have identified her case as one of the most extreme examples of what they term control psychosis, a condition in which the desire for power over others becomes so consuming that it overrides all other human impulses, including basic empathy and self-preservation. Her 10-year experiment in enforced silence stands as a chilling reminder of how absolute power can corrupt not just the ruler, but the very fabric of society itself, creating wounds that may never fully heal. The legacy of the Silent Queen, as Isabella came to be known in historical texts, continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about authoritarianism, social control, and the resilience of human nature. Her reign demonstrates both the terrible efficiency of psychological manipulation when applied systematically, and the ultimate futility of attempting to completely suppress fundamental human behaviors. The fact that her subjects eventually rediscovered their voices, even in the face of extreme punishment, serves as testament to the indomitable nature of human communication and social connection. The scientific study of the Valdres experiment has contributed to modern understanding of trauma, language development, and social psychology. Researchers examining the historical records have identified patterns that help explain how totalitarian regimes maintain control over populations and how societies recover from systematic oppression. The gestural language developed by the silent generation has been studied as an example of rapid linguistic evolution under extreme circumstances, providing insights into the adaptability of human communication systems. The Castle of Valdres stands today as a monument to one woman's descent into madness and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable oppression. Visitors to the ruins report an unusual quality to the silence there, as if the very stones remember the decade when human voices were forbidden and the air itself had become a prison. Some claim that on certain nights when the wind blows through the empty chambers, you can still hear the echo of all the words that were never spoken, all the cries that were swallowed, all the songs that died in silence during the terrible reign of the Queen who ordered the world to hold its breath for 10 years. The story of Queen Isabella and her decade of enforced silence serves as perhaps history's most extreme example of the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. It reminds us that the freedom to speak, to communicate, to share our thoughts and feelings with others is not merely a political right, but a fundamental requirement for human psychological health. The voices that emerged from the earthquake's chaos in that final year were not just sounds breaking an imposed quiet. They were the sound of humanity itself refusing to be silenced, the eternal triumph of the human spirit over even the most determined attempts to crush it into submission. They called her the Silent Queen, but her legacy screams through history. 10 years of forced silence shattered minds, fractured families, and built a kingdom where even babies never heard lullabies. Yet in the end, nature itself rebelled. An earthquake cracked her quiet empire, and the people found their voices in the chaos. If her reign left you speechless, like this video, comment, "What broke your silence?" and subscribe. For more stories of rulers who mistook fear for control and paid the price in screams they couldn't stop.